on becoming a leader. 1. Mastering the context. Leaders have a significant role in creating the state of mind that is a society. They can serve as symbols of the moral unity of the society. They can express the values that hold the society together. Most important, they can conceive and articulate goals that lift people out of their petty preoccupations, carry them above the conflicts that tear society apart, and unite them in pursuit of objectives worthy of their best efforts. In November 1987, Time asked in the cover story, "Who's in charge?" and answered its own question, saying the nation called for leadership, and there is no one home. A recent Google search on lack of leadership produced more than 53.3 million hits, many laments, on the dearth of leaders in world organizations, nations, states, religious organizations, corporations, nonprofit organizations, professions, education, healthcare, sports, and virtually every other human endeavor. The world's hunger for leadership has been growing for years. There is no doubt that a charismatic new leader took the world stage on November 4th, 2008, with the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States. On the night of his victory, millions of Americans wept with pride in their country and relief that he had triumphed over old prejudices. Watching on television, children cheered in the Indonesian grade school the president-elect had attended as a child. Brits raised pints in countless pubs, and Kenyans danced with Obama's relatives in the village where his father was born. But Barack Obama's presidency is in its earliest days, and what we have now is the hope that he will become one of the giants. One result of Barack Obama's extraordinary election is to remind us of just how thin our leadership bench is. Most of the leaders we once revered are gone. FDR, who challenged a nation to rise above fear, is gone. Churchill, who demanded and got blood, sweat, and tears, is gone. Schweitzer, who inspired mankind with a reverence for life from the jungles of Lamborghini, is gone. Einstein, who gave us a sense of unity in infinity of cosmic harmony, is gone. Gandhi, the Kennedys, Martin Luther King, Jr. all were slain. The stage is littered with flawed and disappointing leaders. Ronald Reagan, the Teflon president, was stained by the Iran-Contra disaster and other scandals. Bill Clinton was dogged by rumors of personal indiscretion even before he took office and was impeached, the first elected U.S. president to be censured in so spectacular a fashion. Unlike the 2008 election, the 2000 presidential contest was notable less for the contrast of the candidates than for the roller coaster ride of the process, which ended in George W. Bush being declared the winner, in spite of his trailing Al Gore by 500,000 popular votes. The election was decided for the first time in American history by the Supreme Court, leading to an unprecedented diminution in the minds of many of a body once thought to be above partisan politics. And while President Bush responded forcefully, if belatedly, to the terrorist attacks of 9/11, his administration quickly devolved into a string of disasters he unwarranted: protracted war in Iraq, the shameful symbolism of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib prisons, the bungled rescue of hurricane-battered New Orleans, the outing of CIA agent Valerie Plame, the unprecedented politicization of the Justice Department, and not one but two economic crises. The 2008 meltdown was the worst since the Great Depression. Stocks plunged almost 1,000 points in a single day, and 1.2 million American jobs vanished in the first 10 months of the year. If political leaders disappointed us, corporate leaders proved. Even worse, as evidence emerged of greed and wrongdoing at such once esteemed institutions as Lehman Brothers and major banks, the public and the media call for new leadership and greater regulation. Without drawing much attention to themselves, capable people continue to keep our institutions afloat. Able university presidents, city managers, state governors, heads of non-government organizations, and others, but we increasingly perceived authentic leaders to be an endangered species, buffeted by events and circumstances over which they seem to have little or no control. A scientist at the University of Michigan once listed what he considered to be the 10 basic dangers to our society. First, and most significant, is the possibility of some kind of nuclear war or accident that would destroy the human race. The second danger is the prospect of a worldwide epidemic, disease, famine, or depression. The third of the scientists' key problems that could bring about the destruction of society is the quality of the management and leadership of our institutions. Today, we must add global warming, the widening gap between rich and poor, and international terrorism to that list of major dangers. But the relative lack of leadership continues to be an enormous threat. The simple truth is that 304 million people cannot long abide together without leaders any more than 304 million people can drive on our roads and highways without certain rules, or 11 men can play football without a quarterback, or 4 people can hike from X to Y unless at least one knows where Y is. One person can live on a desert island without leadership. 2 people, if they're totally compatible, could probably get along and even progress. If there are 3 or more, someone has to take the lead. Today we have a more nuanced view of leadership. We no longer think in terms of the Lone Ranger or the great man. But no matter how collaborative our organizations, someone still needs to choreograph the players and make final decisions. Leadership might rotate among the 3 inhabitants on a desert island, as it does in 3 engineer teams at Google, but leadership is needed nonetheless. So let's admit it, in a nation, in a world as complex and fluid as ours, we cannot function without leaders. Our quality of life depends on the quality of our leaders, and we need more than one. As never before, we need leaders in all our organizations and all our institutions. We need leaders in every community, corporation, and country. That leadership vacuum creates an enormous opportunity. If you've ever had dreams of leadership, this is the place, now is the time. There are 3 basic reasons why leaders are important. First, they are responsible for the effectiveness of organizations. The success or failure of all organizations, whether basketball, teams, community action groups, movie makers, makers of video games, auto manufacturers, or lending institutions, rests on the quality of their decision makers. Stock prices rise and fall according to the public perception of how good the leader is. But just as important, the leader is responsible for who is hired, the organization's goals and aspirations, working, conditions, who has authority over whom, morale, allocation of, resources, transparency, and ethical standards. Second, the change and upheaval of the past years has left us with no place to hide. We need anchors and guides. The very best of our leaders serve in that way. They inspire us and restore our hope. Third, there's a pervasive national concern about the integrity of our institutions. It is hard to imagine that there was once a time when Wall Street was a place where a man's word was his bond, until Muriel Siebert bought a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. There were few women on Wall Street. Its reputation tarnished in the 1980s by the white-collar crimes of Ivan Boesky, Michael Milken, and others. Wall Street was gravely damaged in the first years of the 21st century by the greed and double-dealing of a series of CEOs who received imperial compensation even as they bilked both shareholders and their own employees, starting with the discovery that the energy firm Enron endorsed bookkeeping practices that would have embarrassed Al Capone. The nation watched as once trumpeted corporate leaders did the perp walk, led in handcuffs in their homes as TV cameras rolled. In quick succession, criminal charges were brought against top executives at Tyco International, ImClone Systems, and Adelphia Communications, WorldCom Global, Crossing, and other former stars of the new economy tumbled into bankruptcy amidst allegations of fiscal improprieties. A cry immediately went up for the wholesale reform of corporate boards, accounting practices, executive recruitment, and employee retirement plans, a call for sweeping change in how America does business, unlike any since the Great Depression. These scandals were especially troubling to all of us who have been engaged for decades now in training future leaders. Business schools responded quickly to the debacle by adding cautionary case studies of Enron and ImClone to their curricula and beefing up ethics courses. But clearly not everyone learned the lessons on transparency, accountability, and fair play contained in these case studies and reform-minded courses. If they had, there would have been no subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, which shook world markets and left the American public with a $700 billion tab. And American business was not the only institution that showed itself to be gravely flawed. The Roman Catholic Church in the United States experienced an unprecedented series of scandals involving the molestation of children and young adults by priests. The revelation that some priests betrayed and abused children was shocking in its own right, but almost as disturbing was a revelation that members of the Catholic hierarchy had known of the abuse and covered it up, often by reassigning dangerous priests to new parishes where they molested anew. No major American institution seemed unblemished, including the prestigious Ivy League. In 2002, Princeton University staff hacked into admissions records at Yale, apparently to gain information that would help it steal top applicants away from its rival. Scandal also touched government agencies. Where was the Central Intelligence Agency. The public demanded to know when terrorists with expired visas were taking lessons at American flight schools in order to crash into the World Trade Center. And the Pentagon? Where was the CIA, for that matter, when two of its agents spied for years from Moscow? And the Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't fare any better. It, too, failed to prevent the terrorist attacks of 2001 and the deadly mailing of anthrax-laden letters that followed. Perhaps most shocking was the failure of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, to provide services for the mostly poor minority residents who remained in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Bodies floated in the flooded streets for days, while clueless public officials congratulated each other on a job well done. We see these things and we lament them, but what do we do about them? What can we do about them, caught up as we are in the context of our own professional and personal lives? For the most part, our lives are busier and more demanding than those of any generation in recent history, thanks to ubiquitous cell phones and other forms of instant communication. We are tied to our workplaces as never before, immersed in a context that is volatile, turbulent, ambiguous, and all but impossible to escape. That we often feel oppressed by that context is evident from the desperation with which so many people dream of simplifying their lives. But we must master that context if we are to solve our own problems, let alone societal ones. And to do that, we must first examine it. Unfortunately, looking at our own context is as difficult for us as it is for fish to look at water. Everything's in motion. Digital technology and international competition are altering the shape and thrust of American business, changing demographics and the ability to use new technology to identify and serve slices of the population are altering the marketplace, where increasingly the niches, all certain venerable industries such as print journalism, teeter on the verge of extinction, while new green businesses open every day. We now live and work in the global village that Marshall McLuhan predicted. In the European Union, national borders no longer confine workers. In recent years, Eastern Europeans poured into newly wealthy high-tech Ireland. When the Irish economy sagged, Poles working in Ireland returned to their own reinvigorated economy. The economy of the United States is also in flux, just as millions of blue-collar jobs went overseas. In recent decades, more and more white-collar jobs are being exported. Using the internet, a couple can save money on their nuptials in Des Moines by hiring a wedding planner in Bangalore. Aided by their fluency in English, now the universal language of business, professionals in Southeast Asia read American X-rays and vet American contracts, instant communication, and digitally enabled social networking are changing the political as well as the economic map. Markets are freer everywhere, and so are people, as the internet magnifies voices of dissent in such authoritarian nations as Myanmar and Iran, while mergers and acquisitions continue to create international megacorporations. Small, agile companies now generate more new jobs than big traditional industries. Today, Google, Pixar, and other idea-driven firms that know the worth of their Creative talent get first pick of top-notch new graduates. The once dominant big three television networks are now owned or controlled by large corporations, and all three are scrambling to keep market share in a growing field of rivals. Cable networks, such as HBO and Showtime, produce much of the best original programming, and more viewers get there. News from such alternative sources as CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and Comedy Central, home of two of today's most trusted and unlikely newscasters, Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. Thanks to TiVo and other means of recording, programs for later viewing, people watch their favorite shows whenever they choose, and only the masochistic need to sit through commercials, a development that threatens the very economic basis of commercial TV. Deregulation changed the airline industry forever, giving birth to new cut-rate airlines and driving Pan Am and other venerable carriers out of business. But the use of airplanes as flying mega bombs in the 2001 terrorist attacks was a devastating blow to the airline industry and the draconian tightening of security. Procedures after were made flying less attractive than ever. In 2008, soaring gas prices caused airlines to raise ticket prices, trim schedules, and impose fuel surcharges and bag checking fees. To avoid burgeoning travel costs, more and more companies turned to new video conferencing technology, putting even more financial pressure on the troubled airline industry. America's aging population is changing its economy indeed, its culture in ways that are only beginning to be felt. American demographics are shifting in other ways. Latinos have an increasingly powerful voice in American life, as evidenced by the significant role Latino voters played in the election of Barack Obama. Globalization is shaping American life at every turn. American business once owned the American market and much of the European market as well. Today, publishing and other sectors of the American economy are largely European-owned, a trend that is likely to continue as the European Union begins to exercise its true collective clout. European nations will increasingly do business with each other thanks to the elimination of internal trade barriers and the increased use of an almost universal currency, the euro. China would have a major impact on the United States, if only because it holds trillions of dollars of American debt. But China impacts us in many ways. Once primarily an exporting nation, China is now a billion-person market for the rest of the world's goods. Its rapid modernization has caused global shortages of concrete and steel. And China, India, and other ascendant giants are the great unknowns in the life and death question of whether the world will find a way to balance the conflicting needs for growth and limiting greenhouses gases. One result of these global changes is that Wall Street, once the only player, is now one among many financial centers, one subject to such unpredictable forces as overseas investors, currency fluctuations, and an American public that increasingly mistrusts what the street says and does. The new order is so insane that it's hard to satirize, but former Salomon Smith Barney analyst Julius Maldutis captured the madness some years ago when he said, "I have it on good authority that Delta is buying Eastern, Eastern is buying Pan." AM. Pan AM is really going after United now that it is all of United's cash, and Americans' Bob Crandall, who has been devilishly silent all along, is getting ready to make a tender offer for the whole industry once he reaches an agreement with his pilots. Furthermore, I spoke to Frank Lorenzo this morning, and he assured me that his next targets are Peru and Bolivia, which he plans to merge into the first low-cost country. That two of those airlines are long gone only underscores the point. The business world has undergone a series of sea changes in recent decades. Remember the futurist speculation that was all the rage 40 years ago? Despite the flurry of prognostication, no one foresaw the profound impact Japan would have for a time on the American economy. For much of the 1980s, Japan a clutch of distant, overcrowded islands with no basic resources, devastated by World War II and once renowned for producing junk, caused America to have an economic identity crisis. We began to question our vaunted know-how, our conviction that we are the most creative nation on Earth, birthplace of such practical geniuses as Edison and Ford and our claim to the most robust and successful business practices. There were days when we felt that the Japanese did everything better than we did, from designing appealing new automobiles to finding new ways to guarantee quality. Japan soon bested us in manufacturing and marketing what we used to think of as basic American goods, not just cars, but TV sets, even steel. It was only a vicious recession in Japan and the wholesale adoption of the best Japanese practices by our own firms that allowed us to forget the sense we once had of being humiliated by Japanese economic superiority. In the 21st century, it is impossible to predict where the next great economic shift will come from. China, India, Russia, even tiny but wealthy Dubai are merging forces. Most economists believe we are entering a period of slower growth throughout the developed world. And what of the Middle East? Americans are hopeful that our troops will leave Iraq in the near future, but the whole world is nervously watching Iran, a vocal enemy of Israel with nuclear ambitions, the emergence of a particularly violent form of Islamic fundamentalism that uses modern technology to cause chaos in the westernized world continues to shape global politics, and peace in the Middle East is as elusive as ever. As the late John Gardner pointed out, when the founding fathers gathered in Philadelphia to write the Constitution, America had a population of only 3 million, yet 6 world-class leaders were among the authors of that extraordinary document. Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison, Adams, and Franklin created America. Today, there are 304 million Americans, and we wonder every 4 years why we can't find at least 2 superb candidates for the nation's highest office. What happened? As 18th century America was notable for its geniuses, 19th century America was notable for its adventurers, entrepreneurs, inventors, scientists, and writers, the titans who made the Industrial Revolution, the explorers who opened up the West, the writers who defined us as a nation and a people. Thomas Edison, Eli Whitney, Alexander Graham Bell Lewis, and Clark Hawthorne, Melville, Dickinson, Whitman, and Twain. These men and women whose vision matched their audacity built America. 20th century America started to build on the promise of the 19th, but something went terribly wrong. After World War II, America was chiefly notable for its bureaucrats and managers, its organization men, its wheeler-dealers who remade and in some cases unmade the institutions and organizations of America in both the public and private sectors. There have been bright spots, including the rise of the civil rights movement and extraordinary American accomplishments in science and technology. But even though we emerged from World War II as the richest and most powerful nation on earth by the mid-1970s, America had lost its edge. America lost its edge because it lost its way. We forgot what we were here for. The rebellion of the 1960s, the decade that followed, the yuppies of the 1980s, and the subsequent rise of Wall Street's Gordon Geckos with their philosophy that greed is good are all consequences of the mistakes and crudities of the organization men. Unable to find America's head or heart, many of its citizens seem to have declared their independence from it and from each other. While the 1960s saw the birth of such important contributions to our country as the civil rights movement and the women's movement, too many of its so-called breakthroughs became breakdowns. We talked about freedom and democracy, but we sometimes practiced license and anarchy. People were often not as interested in new ideas as they were in recipes and slogans. Gurus Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers told us we could create our own reality, and we did, with everyone insisting on having it his or her way. There has always been a tension in the American character between individual rights and the common good. While we've loved and admired John Wayne striking out on his own with just a horse and a rifle, we've also known that the wagon train couldn't make it across the plains unless we all stuck together. That tension is as fierce today as it has ever been. Whenever upward mobility and good citizenship diverge, we have less and less in common, and less that is good. Our founding fathers based the Constitution on the assumption that there was such a thing as public virtue. James Madison wrote, "The public good, the real welfare of the great body of people is the supreme object to be pursued." But in the early 1920s, when Calvin Coolidge said, "The business of America is business," hardly anyone disagreed. The idea of public virtue had been overtaken by special interests, which today are often replaced by individual concerns. Some in America have devolved into what Robert Bellah and his co-authors describe in their book, Habits of the Heart, as a permissive, therapeutic culture which urges a strenuous effort to make our particular segment of life a small world of its own. Battered by the economic uncertainty of the last decade, many people have retreated into their electronic castles, working at home and communicating with the world via computers and cell phones. They mediate their human contacts through their personal digital assistants, ordering movies from Netflix, and reheating takeout Thai in the microwave. Some would rather instant message than speak. Some prefer virtual reality to what lies outside the front door. A few spend so much time romancing other people's avatars in Second Life that their spouses call their divorce lawyers. Many have two kinds of friends: the ones they actually know and the ones ostentatiously listed on their Facebook page. Cocooning has entered the digital age. The United States stock market has imploded twice in this young century, erasing trillions of dollars of wealth in the process. But the gap between the rich and the poor in the United States remains dangerously wide. The American middle class, which once trusted in its future because of swollen 401k and soaring home equity, has been devastated by the recent crash. Growing numbers of have-nots and have-too-littles worry daily about the skyrocketing cost of health care, ignoring symptoms and splitting pills. Afraid of another Great Depression, some Americans cling to jobs they hate, fearful that their children won't be able to afford college. Meanwhile, certain social and environmental problems continue to haunt us. Poverty and drug addiction perpetuate an American underclass that fills our prisons overflowing, and the oceans continue to rise. For a time, our economic worries were overshadowed by the national trauma of 9/11, which caused virtually all Americans to look at their lives and reconsider their priorities. The wrenching accounts of doomed men and women calling their loved ones from the Twin Towers to say goodbye were seared into the nation's consciousness. So were the images of ordinary people whose control over their lives have been reduced through no fault of their own to the decision of whether to be immolated or jump 100 stories to an equally certain death. For the first time in decades, Americans seem to see themselves as one nation, a single people united in their commitment to democratic principles. Unfortunately, the genuine sense of unity that emerged after the attacks did not lessen the nation's sense of alienation from many of its institutions. There was mistrust in many quarters of a government increasingly martial in tone and eager to eliminate, at whatever cost, an axis of evil embodied in Iraq Saddam Hussein. Many Americans were increasingly estranged from national leaders who seemed to use terrorism as an excuse for hacking away at constitutional protections. As Abigail Adams said, great suffering often engenders great leadership, but pain does not guarantee it. And after 9/11, many Americans were left longing for leadership, as well as for a time not so long ago when terrorism was as rare in America as hunger. Yes, the nation had shared a tragedy, but that suffering did not produce a common vision of what the United States should be and how to achieve it, and we seem to lack leaders of sufficient stature to give us that vision. This, then, was the context, at least until the election in 2008, of a young president promising change and renewed hope, what those geniuses created in Philadelphia in the 18th century and their rowdy successors embellished in the 19th century, uninspired leaders and passive followers in both government and business, too often turn into a giant machine, its wheels spinning frantically in the mud, going nowhere. Like the outsized American cars of the Eisenhower era, America often seems too big and too awkward to work very well, much less respond quickly and wisely to events. This became painfully evident in the wake of 9/11 when Americans discovered, to their shock and dismay, that our security apparatus was vast but dangerously inefficient. It seems that the FBI had been collecting information as assiduously as ever, but hadn't bothered to update its computer networks so that information could be shared, analyzed, and acted upon quickly and effectively. The CIA had failed to reinvent itself after the fall of the Soviet Union and had failed to anticipate new threats that would require new foreign language skills and other capabilities. The security agencies had a history of turf wars, not cooperation, and even when crucial information was flowing, it could be blocked by a single preoccupied supervisor or one with his or her own agenda. Combine those systemic flaws with an arrogant belief that the unimaginable couldn't happen here, and disaster was inevitable. But authentic leaders are able to analyze the context and transcend it. Always an innovator, television producer / writer, Norman Lear has enjoyed astonishing success financially as well as creatively. When I talk with him, we discuss not only his life and his work, but also his concern with what he described as the societal disease of our time, short-term thinking. It's asking what the poll is saying, not what's great for the country and what's best for the future, but what do I say in the short term to get me from here to there? And that national obsession with the short term has come directly from business, Lear continued. Joseph Campbell once said that in medieval times, as you approached the city, your eye was taken by the cathedral. Today, it's the towers of commerce. It's business, 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 and in an escalating fashion it has gotten more short-term oriented. You know, they're not funding the real iconoclasts today, not funding the innovators, because that's risky, that's long-term investment. I think Lear is absolutely right. American business has become the principal shaper and mover in contemporary America, even more so than television, and has, in an odd irony, by zealously practicing what it preaches, sandbagged itself. Having captured the heart and mind of the nation with its siren songs of instant gratification, it has locked itself into obsolete practices before the flame out of the new economy and the equally spectacular fall from grace of the American CEO. Corporate leaders had achieved a popularity such as they had never experienced before in history. But even as we fawned over these corporate superstars, we failed to ask a crucial question: how much genuine leadership was being practiced inside even the most successful companies? How many of those we believed to be leaders were really corporate Wizards of Oz, their perceived abilities as illusory as their cookbooks? Richard Ferry, former president and co-founder of the recruiting firm of Korn Ferry International, spoke to the problem of short-term thinking 2 decades ago, and his observations are just as relevant today. Corporate America may talk on an intellectual level about what it'll take to succeed in the 21st century, but when it gets right down to decision-making, all that matters is the next quarterly earnings report. That's what's driving much of the system. With that mindset, everything else becomes secondary to the ability to deliver the next quarterly earnings push-up. We're on a treadmill. The reward system in this country is geared to the short term. Our addiction to the short term gave us freeze-frame shots of a changing world, preventing us from seeing that it was shrinking, heating up, growing rancorous and ambitious, not just politically, but socially and economically, just as our forebears challenged British rule, China, Japan, and Korea, virtually all of Europe, Scandinavia, and Australia have challenged American corporate rule, even as the Arab nations began to take back their oil. These upstarts are beating us at our own game, manufacturing, and marketing. Japan, above all, saw that the marketplace was the real battlefield, and that trade was not only the ultimate weapon, but the source of true national security. The Soviet Union's recognition that trade trumps ideology led to its inevitable dismantling and accounts for the eager self-interest with which the Czech Republic and other former Soviet countries sought inclusion in the European Union, perhaps because they're centuries older than we are, and therefore more sophisticated and wiser. Our friends in Asia and Europe know that political regimes come and go, and ideologies wax and wane, but human nature being what it is, our basic needs are economic, not political. Some in America are still addicted to the quick fix and the fast buck. They haven't yet realized that the new bottom line is that there is no bottom line. There aren't any lines, much less limits or logic. Life on this turbulent, complex planet is no longer linear and sequential, one thing logically leading to another. It is spontaneous, contrary, unexpected, and ambiguous. Things do not happen according to plan, and they are not reducible to tidy models. We persist in grasping at neat, simple answers when we should be questioning everything. Wallace Stevens, a renowned poet who was also vice president of an insurance company, put it nicely in his poem, 6 Significant Landscapes. Rationalists wearing square hats think in square rooms, looking at the floor, looking at the ceiling. They can find themselves to right-angled triangles if they tried rhomboids, cones, waving lines, ellipses, as, for example, the ellipse of the half-moon. Rationalists would wear sombreros. It's time for America to trade in its square hat on a sombrero or a beret and consider this new context. And as Norman Lear put it, one person can matter, a citizen can matter in this country. Today, the opportunities for leaders are boundless, but so are the challenges. Our best and brightest are as smart, innovative, and capable as any generation of leaders has ever been, but the route to the top is more arduous and trickier than it has ever been, and the top itself is more slippery and more treacherous than Everest ever was. But reaching the top is not the only goal. Today's leaders often reinvent themselves periodically in order to scale new mountains. We sometimes feel that we are at least halfway through the looking glass on our way to utter chaos. And though the context is highly volatile, it's not apt to change in any fundamental way as long as the principal players are driven by it, are swimming through it like fish blind to the water. To put it another way, the current climate is self-perpetuating because it has created an entire generation of managers in its own image. As we have discovered recently, too many CEOs became bosses, not leaders, and it is the bosses who have gotten America into its current fix. Ironically, they are as much products of the context as today's corporate scandals are. They are perfect expressions of the context, driving, but going nowhere. The first step in becoming a leader, then, is to recognize the context of what it is: a breaker, not a maker; a trap, not a launching pad; an end, not a beginning; and declare your independence, surrendering to the context. Having described the context, I'm tempted to skip a step and go right to the people who beat it. Success is more fun than failure. To write about as well as to live. Besides, everyone knows people who didn't get what they wanted out of life. But learning from failure is one of the most important themes in this book, one that we'll return to again and again. So I think we need to look at one case, one individual who didn't make it out of the quagmire, and some of the reasons why. I'll call him Ed. Ed was born of working-class parents in Brooklyn, New York. Smart, ambitious, determined to succeed, he went to work in a factory right out of high school and enrolled in night school, working day and night. He managed to take a degree in accounting. He moved off the factory floor and into management with the same manufacturing firm in a few short years. He fought his way up the ladder, passing some MBAs on the way. He proved himself to be not only hard-working and aggressive, but a talented nuts and bolts man, efficient, competent, and tough. He eventually was made a vice president. Ed was a company man. Everyone said so. He not only knew how everything worked, he was capable of making it work better, and when necessary, he didn't mind yanking out the deadwood. He was not an easy man to work for, but he was just the kind of man his bosses liked. He was 100% loyal to the company, a workaholic, always willing and eager to go that extra mile, and impatient with anyone who was less devoted than he. Ed's competence, combined with his drive and toughness, made him an ideal executive in the win-or-die 1980s and 90s. To look at him or see him in action, no one would have ever guessed that he grew up poor on the streets of South Brooklyn, or that he was a night school product. In fact, he'd nearly forgotten it himself. He looked, dressed, and talked like his bosses. He had an attractive, devoted wife who looked, dressed, and talked like his boss's wives. He had 2 handsome, well-behaved sons, a nice house in Westchester, a wicked serve, and great prospects if he wanted to move. The president of the company was in his early 50s, Ed's age, and apparently happy with his position. About the time Ed began getting restless, a family-owned firm in the same industry was looking for new blood. The CEO, the grandson of the founder, was thinking of retirement, and there was no one to whom he could hand the reins. He wanted to bring someone in as a vice president, get to know him, and if all went well, turn over the firm to him within 2 or 3 years, although the firm was based in Minneapolis. The executive search firm found Ed in New York. Ed saw the move to Minneapolis as a shortcut to the top. He handled the job hop as efficiently as he handled everything else. He moved his family into a bigger and better house in Edina, moved himself into a big corner office with a view of a lake, and seemed to adjust to the slower Midwestern rhythm without missing a beat. But he was, if anything, tougher than before, coming down, harder than ever on people who failed to please him. The more relaxed Minnesotans in the office made fun of him privately, nicknamed him the Brooklyn Bomber. But when he said jump, they jumped. After Ed had been in Minneapolis about a year, Baxter, the CEO, took him a lunch and offered him the COO spot. Ed was pleased, but not surprised. No one worked harder than he did. No one could have learned more about the company than he had, and no one deserved it more. The sky was the limit for the Bomber now. Baxter and Ed were a great team. Baxter, genial and encouraging, steered the company, while Ed, tougher than ever, took care of the nuts and bolts and dirty work. Baxter decided that Ed was indeed the fellow to replace him when he retired, and he announced the decision to the family, who were also the board of directors. For the first time in his life, Ed ran into something he couldn't tough his way through. Some members of the family board told Baxter that Ed was too tough, too rough on his fellow executives. They would not approve his appointment unless he improved his people skills. Baxter gave Ed the bad news. If Ed was disturbed, and so was the CEO. Baxter was ready to retire, and further, he'd chosen Ed as a successor and begun to groom him for the job. Now his orderly plan had fallen apart. At this point, Baxter called a friend who recommended that he hire me as a consultant. After outlining his dilemma, he asked me if I'd work with Ed to help him improve his people skills. He said Ed was willing to do whatever it took to secure the CEO slot. After a lot of conversation and thought, I agreed, although I had certain reservations. It was an interesting task, and I had enough other business taking me to Minneapolis that it didn't mean rearranging my life drastically. Still, I wondered whether anyone could affect what amounted to a basic personality change in a 55-year-old man. On my next trip to Minneapolis, I met Ed. I spent a couple of days shadowing him, watching everything he did and how he did it. On the following trip, I interviewed everyone who worked with Ed and asked him to take a series of personality tests. Everyone was, of course, operating out of self-interest, anxious to retire. Baxter wanted a successor in place ASAP. The recalcitrant board members wanted a way out of this difficult situation, which I would have to give them whether I succeeded or failed in working a change in Ed, who was never anything but cooperative, wanted the job. After a while, it became clear to me that everything everyone said about Ed was true. He was very competent and very ambitious, but he was also a tyrant. He was impulsive and frequently abusive of people who worked for him. They would actually cower in his presence. He had a desperate need to control both people and events. He was incapable of thanking anyone for a job well done. He couldn't even give a compliment. And, of course, he was a sexist. Ed tackled his problem the way he tackled everything else, at full speed and with all of his resources. In the course of my work with him, he became easier to get along with. He managed to smooth away his rougher edges. He became less abrasive, more polite as he fine-tuned himself in the same way he fine-tune the company. That was the good news. The bad news was that for all Ed's effort, the people who worked with him continued to be wary of him. They just didn't trust the new Ed, and the board remained divided. The members who liked the old Ed and his no-nonsense bottom line philosophy were somewhat thrown by his new, milder demeanor, while the ones who had originally blocked Ed's ascendants now found new flaws. They argued that, for all his drive and competence, he lacked both vision and character, believing that character is as vital in a leader as drive and competence. I had to agree with them. And character was something I couldn't help Ed find. He would have to do that on his own. As I've said before, it is not enough for a leader to do things right. He must do the right thing. Furthermore, a leader without some vision of where he wants to take his organization is not a leader. I had no doubt that Ed could run the company. I had grave doubts about where he might take it. After telling Ed that, while I was impressed with his progress, I could not recommend him for CEO, I filed my report with Baxter and the board. Baxter, I discovered, was actually relieved. While he had needed someone like Ed to help him run the business, he had known that the board was right. The business that had been in the family for 3 generations was on the line, and they simply couldn't turn it over to Ed. Baxter stayed on, and Ed stayed in place until another successor for Baxter was found. Baxter then retired, and Ed resigned. If this had been a movie, of course, Ed would have turned into Jimmy Stewart by the last reel and gotten the job. But real life doesn't work like the movies, and heroes and villains aren't as easy to spot. In fact, I don't think Ed was either a hero or a villain. He was a victim, a man who saw himself as self-made, but who, in fact, had patterned himself after the wrong models in the wrong corporate culture. He came into the business world as a tough street kid, a boy from the wrong side of the tracks who was determined to make good. He was ambitious and industrious, but ultimately he was just another product of the prevailing climate. Whatever character or vision he might have had atrophied along the way, Ed might have learned to lead. Certainly when he started work in the factory, he had a passion for the promises of life. But then he went through the looking glass into a dog-eat-dog world, where people were rewarded not for expressing themselves, but for proving themselves. In proving himself an ideal servant of the system, Ed never fully deployed himself. He allowed himself to be deployed by his employer. Himself driven, he drove others, becoming the perfect boss. He couldn't adjust to a new corporate climate where vision and character were important. When I sorted it out afterward, I realized that there were actually 5 things that the board was interested in: technical competence, people skills, conceptual skills, judgment and taste, and character. It wasn't just the people skills as they had originally told me. So even when he worked hard to improve in that area, he simply could not get people on his side. They questioned his judgment and his character, and they felt that they couldn't trust him. Since this is the era of failing upward, Ed is now chairman and CEO of a prominent Atlanta manufacturing firm. He was credited by its search committee not only with his own nut sand, Bolt's successes, but with all of Baxter's achievements, two including the creation of new products and maintaining a reputation for service and quality that are admired in the industry. Unfortunately, when Ed tightens all the nuts and bolts in Atlanta, but fails to generate new products or revenues, he may find the context unforgiving unless he learns from his failure and he chooses to begin the arduous process of becoming himself. I haven't been able to find out, because he won't return my phone calls. We all know EDS. In fact, they tend to be more the rule than the exception. But as you will see, people can and do overturn the rules and overcome the context and succeed in ways that the EDS can only imagine. Mastering the context. The leader I've picked to underscore the reasons why it didn't make the grade is Norman Lear. He broke into TV during its so-called golden age as a comedy writer for such shows as the Colgate Comedy Hour, the George Gobel Show, and the Martha Raye Show, which he also directed. In 1959, Lear and Bud Yakin founded Tandem Productions, which produced and packaged TV specials, with such stars as Fred Astaire, Jack Benny, Danny Kaye, Carol Channing, and Henry Fonda. Tandem produced a number of theatrical feature films, too, including Come Blow Your Horn, The Night They Raided Minsky's, Start the Revolution Without Me, and Cold Turkey. Lear's original screenplay, Divorce, American Style, earned an Academy Award nomination in 1967. By any definition, Lear was a success, but in 1971 he and Tandem took a giant step upward with the premiere of the landmark TV series All in the Family. That series, featuring the unforgettable Archie Bunker and the various series that followed, Sanford and Son, Maude, The Jeffersons, One Day at a Time, and Mary Hartman revolutionized television and gave America a funny but acute look at itself. The brilliant writer Patty Chayefsky said, Norman Lear took television away from the dopey wives and dumb fathers, from the pimps, hookers, hustlers, private eyes, junkies, cowboys, and rustlers that constituted television chaos. And in their place he put the American people. He took the audience and put them on the set more than anyone else. Lear caused TV to grow up. Not only were his shows hits, they were not afraid to be controversial, focusing on such then taboo issues as abortion and prejudice. But no one wanted All in the Family in the beginning. It was turned down by ABC, reluctantly aired by CBS, and hardly watched it all for a while. Fortunately, CBS stuck with it, and Lear not only mastered the context, he revolutionized it. In each of 11 consecutive seasons, 1971 to 1982, at least one Lear situation comedy placed in the top 10 of all primetime programs. In 1974 to 1975, 5 of the top 10 shows were Lear's. In November 1986, 5 of the top 9 off-network sitcoms in syndication were his. Nearly 60% of Lear's pilots have sold as series, which is twice the industry average. More than a third of all his network series went on to become hits in syndication, 3 times the industry average. Lear's career, consistently characterized by innovation and risk, proves the efficacy of both. For Lear is not only a creative Phenomenon, but a financial wizard as well. But when the Writers Guild of America went on strike in March 1988, this man, who revolutionized an industry, this multimillionaire, this communications pioneer and leader, walked the picket lines with his fellow writers and loved it. Lear has performed brilliantly as a writer, a producer, a businessman, and a citizen activist. He is co-founder of People for the American Way, a foundation devoted to civil rights and liberties. His counsel continues to be sought by presidential candidates and other politicians, and he continues to contribute to American public life in other ways. In 2000, he and internet entrepreneur David Hayden paid a record $7.40 million for the original copy of the Declaration of Independence and announced plans to make it available to the public. Lear also donated more than $5 million to establish a multidisciplinary center at the University of Southern California for the study of the implications of the convergence of entertainment, commerce, and society. The Norman Lear Center conducts academic research and shapes public policy. Lear's story is the American dream made manifest, a plot straight out of Horatio Alger, except that he didn't marry the boss's daughter. Starting with nothing, he has become very, very rich and very, very famous and very, very powerful. Indeed, his life is the stuff of which TV shows and movies are made. His accomplishments prove, beyond a doubt, the efficacy of full self-expression. There are 4 steps in the process behind Norman Lear's success in mastering the context. 1. Becoming self-expressive. 2. Listening to the inner voice. 3. Learning from the right mentors. And 4. Giving oneself over to a guiding vision. These steps are all illustrated in the story. He told me of how he was profoundly influenced by Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, in high school. Emerson talks about listening to that inner voice and going with it against all voices to the contrary. I don't know when I started to understand that there was something divine about that inner voice to go with. That which I confess I don't do all the time is the purest, truest thing we have. And when we forego our own thoughts and opinions, they end up coming back to us from the mouths of others. They come back with an alien majesty. So the lesson is, you believe it. When I've been most effective, I've listened to that inner voice. Listening to the inner voice, trusting the inner voices, one of the most important lessons of leadership. I think it's so important that I've devoted the bulk of 1 chapter to it later. In this book, Lear spoke, too, of other influential people in his life. My grandfather was the person who taught me very early on that you can matter. I lived with him between the ages of 9 and 12. He was an inveterate letter writer, and I was a captive audience. For every one of those letters, my dearest, darling Mr. President, don't you listen to them when they say such and such and so, or if he disagreed with the president, it was, my dearest, darling Mr. President, you should never have done such and such. I ran down the 4 flights of stairs to the brass mailbox to pick up the mail each day. Every once in a while, my 91/2-10-11-year-old heart would miss a beat because there was a little white envelope that said White House on it. I couldn't get over it. The White House was writing to him. My father was a guy who had bits and pieces of paper in his pockets and in the brim of his hat, and that's how he managed things. He was always into more than he could handle, because he was never organized. So I guess inversely, he taught me the need to be prepared and keep both feet on the ground. He was a man who knew he was going to have $1 million in 2 weeks. And of course he never made it. But he never stopped believing. He leaned into life like M. Hewlett bent in with head, tilting the stride strong. Like his father, the rascal, the son has never stopped believing, and he, too, leans into life. He told me, first and foremost, find out what it is you're about, and be that. Be what you are, and don't lose it. It's very hard to be who we are, because it doesn't seem to be what anyone wants. But, of course, as Lear has demonstrated, it's the only way to truly fly. Norman Lear had a guiding vision, a belief in himself, a belief that he could make a difference, and that vision allowed him to master the context in television, an arena in which producers traditionally survive by being like everybody else, by coming up with a clone of last season's hit, by playing to the lowest common denominator with the least objectionable programming. Lear not only made it to the top and stayed there for 2 decades, and this in an industry in which 5 years is considered a career, he did it by producing original shows that stood out in bright colors next to their pale competitors. He was there for others to point to when a new show didn't become a hit right away. Thanks to Lear's success, other worthy shows were given a second chance. It is no exaggeration to say that television would not now be airing such highly touted, groundbreaking shows as 30 Rock, Entourage, and Dexter if it were not for Norman, Lear, and All in the Family. Of course, Lear resides at the extreme. He is the creator of his circumstances and surroundings in a way that few of us are able to match. But there are Norman Lears in all walks of life who master the context wherever they are. And leaders have always fought the context. Mathilde Krim, the scientist who has long been a leader in the fight on AIDS, said, "I have little tolerance for institutional restraints. Institutions should serve people, but unfortunately it's often the other way around. People give their allegiance to an institution and they become prisoners of habits, practices, and rules that make them ultimately ineffectual. If most of us, like Ed, are creatures of our context, prisoners of the habits, practices, and rules that make us ineffectual, it is from the Norman Lears, the people who not only challenge and conquer the context, but who change it in fundamental ways, that we must learn. The first step toward change is to refuse to be deployed by others and to choose to deploy yourself. Thus the process begins.